Working night shifts in cold weather is certainly challenging. Yet the greater hardship lies in abandoning the warmth and comfort of one's bed early in the morning to fulfill work obligations. That is why I always preferred night shifts over morning shifts and used to volunteer for that, a thing none of my fellow officers willingly did. However, it was only when I experienced something strange and terrifying that my safety began to matter more to me than my comfort. It was about 1 month ago when I was driving back to my house after completing my night shift duty. Since I finished work a little early that day, I decided to leave 3 hours before my actual pack-up time, which was 5 in the morning. As I left the office, I settled into my car, started the engine, and navigated through the thick fog. It was my first time traveling at 2 o'clock at night, which made me feel a little weird. However, dismissing these unsettling feelings, I continued driving at a leisurely pace, comforted by the absence of other vehicles on the late-night road. Little did I know that this comfort was very short-lived. After covering about half a distance from my office, the engine of my car stuttered, and it suddenly started to stall, a sign that my vehicle was about to run out of fuel. Shocked, I remembered filling the tank just the day before. It dawned on me that a friend, in the habit of borrowing my car, had likely used up the fuel, which caused me to feel overly enraged. However, this was not the time to be angry, but to think about how to reach home. After a little contemplation, I decided to use the shortcut route, an empty road that passed through the middle of the forest and could help me cover the 45-minute distance in around 20 minutes. Hoping that my car's fuel would be enough to help me cover that distance, I turned my car and started to drive on that path. Despite knowing that it was dangerous to use such a desolate road, I kept driving, determined to reach home as soon as I could. On my way, the only things I could see were the glinting eyes of the wild animals amidst the dense fog and their sounds, which caused my fear and anxiety to grow. Despite trying to calm myself down by saying that there was nothing to worry about, my heart kept beating faster with every passing moment. I felt as if the path was getting darker as I moved on and wondered whether I was even on the right path, considering that it was my first time using that road. However, despite all that, my urge to reach home as soon as I could kept me determined to move forward until 10 minutes passed and I was almost halfway on the road. As unlucky as the day was for me, my car, which had been warning me of low fuel for quite some time, finally ran out of fuel and stopped. Despite having expected such a thing to happen, it was still shocking for me, considering the time and place I was currently at. Having no choice but to stay there for the time being, I switched off the headlights of the car, spreading an eerie darkness in the surroundings. There was no gas station anywhere nearby, and I could not get a lift since no one was likely to come driving on such a path in the middle of the night. Making the situation even worse was the fact that the mobile network was not working in that area, making me unable to contact my friends and ask for help. Feeling scared and anxious, I closed all the windows of my car and decided to sit silently, waiting for dawn while hoping that someone would pass by and give me a lift. In that hope, I kept sitting inside the car, hearing the voices of wild animals amidst the echoing silence. Being extremely tired, I did not realize when I dozed off. It was about an hour later, at around 3 o'clock, that this silence was broken by the sound of a vehicle engine jolting me awake. Getting up, I quickly turned around, finding a van stopped right behind my car with its bright headlights illuminating the surroundings. Relieved that I could finally receive someone's help and get out of this situation, I was about to unlock my car and ask the driver for a lift. However, just then, my hands suddenly stopped and my instincts warned me to be cautious. Deeply thinking about the entire situation, it felt a little strange to me for the vehicle to have stopped in the middle of the empty road like that. Even if they had stopped noticing my car, the driver would have come out of the van and asked if something was wrong, yet nothing like that happened. Considering the extremely negative vibe the atmosphere was giving me, I decided to stay inside the car and avoid interacting with the driver, who seemed rather suspicious. A few moments later, one of the doors of the van opened, and someone came out of it, causing my fear to increase tenfold. Hearing the footsteps coming closer and closer to my car, my heart skipped a beat. Despite hoping it would be a helper, I could not shake off the feeling of dread I was having at the moment. While I was engrossed in my fear and nervousness, there was a knock at the window of my door, accompanied by a masculine voice. "Can I help you in case you're facing some problem?" The person asked in a soft and concerned voice. Confused about whether to trust the person or not, I kept staring at his face for a few moments. Sensing my confusion, the person explained that he was passing by the road and noticed my car standing, which is why he stopped to inquire whether there was anything wrong. Thinking of the person as kind and considerate despite his negative aura, I explained whatever had happened to me while I was on my way home. Remarking that he was sorry to hear that, the person told me not to worry and offered to tie my car to his van and tow it to a gas station. This offer seemed like a relief to me, and I gladly agreed, thanking the person for offering assistance. Trusting the person, I quickly came out of my car, while the person walked back to his van, started the engine, and brought it in front of my car to tie it up. Taking out a rope from his van, he then tied up the car while I stood aside, feeling relieved to have finally gotten a chance to escape this haunting place. After tying up the car to his van, the person offered me to sit inside his can and open the front door for me. Thanking him, I walked towards the door of the van, yet what I saw sent chills down my spine. Inside the van, I saw 3 blood-stained sacks placed on the back seat that seemed to carry dead bodies. Realizing that it was actually a trap that made me vulnerable, I stood frozen in shock, staring at the sacks with disbelief. The very next moment, something heavy struck my head, causing blood to trickle down my face and leading my vision to blur. Unable to stand the major blow, I crashed to the ground, becoming unable to get on my feet. Lying on the cold road, I started to hear the voices of more footsteps approaching, with the person who attacked me commanding them to throw the sacks in the forest so they could take the car away. A few hours later, when I regained consciousness, it was already afternoon, and I was in the hospital with my colleagues standing around me with worried expressions on their faces. They told me that I was found unconscious on the same empty road by a patrol van that was passing by and was brought to the hospital. After a while, a few cops entered the room and asked me about the details of the incident, which I explained in detail. Remembering the leader of the group instructing his people to throw the blood-stained sacks in the forest, I told them about that as well. Upon getting that information, a thorough search of the area was conducted, and the sacks were finally found. It was revealed that the sacks did not contain the dead bodies of humans, but the remains of wild animals whose body parts seemed to have been stolen for smuggling purposes. The police told me that it was a smuggling gang that had come to the forest to throw away the remains of animals and decided to steal my car when they saw me. This was a traumatic experience for me that left a deep impact on my psyche. Even though my car could not be found after that, I still felt relieved that at least my life was spared. It was after that that I decided never to work night shifts again. Even if it caused me to sacrifice my sleep, it was at least better than sacrificing my life. Being a tall and muscular person, people admired me a lot, associating my figure with a courageous and daring personality, something that increased my self-confidence, prompting me to take on challenging tasks. However, I did not realize that, as a human, I also had certain fears and weaknesses and was not perfect. This realization struck me during one of my night shift duties, guarding a factory located at the edge of a forgotten town that had long lost its purpose and merely stood as a monument to decay. It was a dark night with dense clouds covering the sky, as if it would start pouring cats and dogs at any moment. Amidst the wind howling through the desolate landscape surrounding the factory, I stood determined to fulfill my duty with honesty. After taking a quick round outside the factory, I came to the front and settled into the small security booth. Although I never felt loneliness and isolation so greatly, there was something about the place that arose a sense of dread within me, making me confused. Silence never felt so haunting to me, yet that night I really wanted to have someone to keep me company. Therefore, I turned on the radio and began listening to a show, providing a faint link to civilization in such desolation. Feeling somewhat better after listening to the radio, I maintained a vigilant watch around the building, contemplating the unfamiliar feeling I was experiencing for the first time in my life. Several hours passed, and it was well into the middle of the night when a disconcerting rustling reverberated through the empty halls, instantly alerting me. Focusing on the rhythmic creaking, amplified by the surrounding silence, I began to feel an unwanted presence within the confines of the factory. Rising from my chair, I cautiously walked towards the building, tinged with a hint of anxiety and nervousness. Upon entering, I navigated carefully through the dimly lit corridors, discovering a shattered window on the east side of the factory. The moonlight illuminated the shards scattered across the floor, exposing a potential point of entry for someone with malicious intentions. Realizing that I had neglected my duty due to becoming too engrossed in the radio, a wave of shame washed over me. To make amends, I resolved to confront the intruder and punish them for their actions. Thus, I proceeded with further investigation, tracing a trail of muddy footprints leading deeper into the heart of the factory. Despite feeling a sense of fear, I continued to follow the tracks within the maze-like structure, which served to heighten my sense of vulnerability. Finally, after walking around in the dark and desolate building for some time, I entered an abandoned assembly room where an unsettling sight was waiting for me. In front of me was a tall, hooded figure obscured by shadows who hunched over a workbench. Standing still, I saw the metallic glint of a knife reflected in the dim light as the person meticulously sharpened its blade. Realizing that the person came not with the intent of stealing but to harm, I felt a sudden wave of fear that caused my body to tremble. Quickly reaching for my pocket to take out my gun, I realized that I had left it in the security booth and came unarmed. Something a security guard would never do. Calling myself a fool to have made such a mistake, I quickly reached for my radio phone, trying to summon help while the person turned around, the sharp knife now clenched in his hand. Desperate to save my life, I kept trying to contact the security department, yet the oppressive silence that followed my call sent shivers down my spine. Having no choice but to deal with the matter myself, I turned to the person, inquiring about his intentions. Giving a malicious smile in response, the hooded person uttered the word blood and started to laugh loudly. Amidst the cruel laugh that seemed to turn me deaf, I suddenly began to hear a faint sound of crying, which made me confused. Focusing my torch on the corner of the room, I found a small child tied up to the chair with his mouth covered by a tape that blocked his desperate cries from reaching my ears. However, I could still see the overwhelming fear in his eyes, along with a faint glimmer of hope that I brought to him. The realization that the person came to kill the child and not me was rather shocking for me, for it would make no sense for a man like him to target a child who was so weak and powerless. While I was thinking that, the person started to walk towards the child, with the sharp blade of the knife gleaming in the faint night. Realizing that the child was in grave danger, I lost control of my senses and began to run after the person, throwing my torch in his direction and striking his head, momentarily halting his movement and causing him to drop the knife. Turning around in anger, the person, who looked more like a psychiatric patient, let out a scream and started to run towards me. Taking the chance, I quickly moved towards the knife and took hold of it while throwing my radio phone at the person to halt his movement again. Taking the opportunity, I then launched an attack on the person from behind, inflicting a deep cut on his leg in the process and successfully apprehending him. Upon hearing the commotion, police officers patrolling nearby swiftly entered the building, taking decisive action against the intruder and assisting in the rescue of the child. As the night transitioned into the morning, the traumatized child was promptly transported to the hospital. Following necessary medical attention, he disclosed that he had been abducted by the perpetrator while returning from school and had been confined within the building for the past 48 hours. Upon learning that, I was profoundly shocked and disappointed in my unawareness of the events transpiring within the building under my watchful eye. Had it not been for the shattering of glass, the child might have lost his life, leaving me to grapple with remorse for the rest of my life. In my 7 years of career as a nurse, I have interacted with countless patients, some suffering from diseases so pathetic that they terrified a normal person. However, being extremely dedicated to my profession, I had never feared diseases, injuries, or even dead bodies. Yet, it was only about a year ago that I experienced something extremely terrifying that led me to resign from my job at the hospital and join a small medical center at a university to offer my services. It was the 25th of December, a holiday that I had to spend overtime in case an emergency case arrived in the absence of the medical staff. The hospital buzzed with the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of medical equipment. The night was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the empty hallways. I was alone at the nursing station, diligently going through patient charts as the clock ticked towards midnight. Feeling a little unwell, my fellow nurse had gone to rest, telling me to wake her up if an emergency case arrived. Assuring her that I would deal with the patients in the meantime, I sent her away to take a nap and continued with my work. It might have been around 15 minutes later that the automatic doors of the nursing station swung open, bringing a gust of cold wind along with an unexpected visitor inside. Thinking that it must be one of the usual patients complaining of fever or flu, I did not look up and kept engrossed in my work. Hearing the stumbling footsteps getting closer to the reception, I lifted my gaze upwards, only to be shocked to see an extremely injured person barely managing to walk towards me. His clothes were stained with blood and his labored breaths hinted at the severity of his injuries. Panicked to see him in such a critical state, I quickly ran to him to help him sit in a wheelchair and take him to the operating theater. However, as soon as I came closer, I froze in shock to see the person taking out a gun from his pocket and pointing it at me, telling me to treat his injuries without informing anyone of his presence in the hospital. Looking at the gun in shock, I suddenly noticed the notorious gang tattoos that adorned his exposed arms. This made me realize that he was not an ordinary person, but one of the most wanted criminals who escaped during the church ceremony, held in the prison house. Thinking that it would be wrong to help a dangerous prisoner while feeling obliged to provide first aid to him considering my profession, I became increasingly confused. Being unable to decide what to do, I felt torn between my duty to provide medical care and the realization that danger had just crossed the threshold. While I was thinking that I did not realize when the person came closer and put his gun on my head, causing a shiver to run down my spine. "Don't make a sound, or else you'll be dead," the man said in a threatening tone. Looking at the room where my fellow nurse was resting, I really wanted to shout and call her in, yet the overwhelming fear of death, looming above my head, seemed to have taken my voice away. Having no choice but to comply with what he said, I began to move towards the operation theater. Once there, the person sat on the stretcher, pulling the sleeve of his tattooed arm, while still pointing a gun at me with the other one. The wound on his arm was made by a bullet that got stuck into his muscles, and he wanted me to remove it so he could leave. Complying, I asked him to lie down so I could induce anesthesia and start the treatment. However, to my shock, he refused to take any anesthetic or narcotic that could impact his senses and told me to simply inflict a deep cut on his wound and take out the bullet stuck inside. Considering him to be insane to be ready to bear such overwhelming pain, I stared at him with disbelief while he shook my arm, urging me to do it fast if I wanted to leave the theater alive. Trembling with fear, I grabbed a scalpel from the surgical equipment and began to cut through the wound while noticing the expressionless face of the gangster, who did not seem to feel any pain. Taking the forceps, I then tried to pull out the bullet stuck in his arm muscles, causing him to clench his eyes and teeth, as if trying to suppress his pain as the bullet got removed from his body. After cleaning the wound, I began to tie it up with trembling hands while the person kept staring at me with his finger on the trigger of the loaded gun. After I was done tying up his wound, the intercom on the reception began to ring, breaking the haunting silence. Thinking of it as a chance to ask for help, I excused the person, stating that I had to go attend to other matters while offering him to stay inside until he got better. However, instead of allowing me to leave, the person quickly got up, blocked my way, and started to attach a silencer to the gun. Taken aback by his act, I began to contemplate what his intentions were, feeling scared and anxious. Curving his lips in a sinister smile, the person looked straight at me, stating that I would not have expected to live after seeing his face that no one had ever seen. Realizing that he was intending to kill me so that I could not tell anyone about him, I staggered, never having expected death to strike me like that. Watching him put his finger on the trigger, I closed my eyes, realizing how helpless I was. A few moments later, the sound of a gun being fired reverberated throughout the entire operation theater while I kept standing straight with my eyes closed. Being overly consumed by shock and fear, It was only after a few moments that I realized that the bullet did not strike me. Moreover, despite fixing a silencer to the gun, the sound that it made was way too loud, causing me to realize that it was not the gangster's gun in the first place. Confused about who would have fired the bullet in that case, I opened my eyes, finding the person lying dead on the floor with his blood spilled all over. Consumed by an utter disbelief, I looked at the door, finding our security officer standing there, causing a relief to wash over me. Following the officer, my fellow nurse, who was taking a rest in the room, entered equally shocked at the scene. Remarking that he was a truly dangerous individual who was sought after in the entire city, the security officer apologized to me for letting such a person in the first place. With that, he called for the rest of the staff, as well as the cops, who were patrolling in the vicinity, looking for that person. After a few formalities, the dead body of the person was taken away. My fellow nurse informed me that, when I was not picking up the phone, she came out of the room to check up on me but could not find me. Hearing voices from the operation theater, she walked towards it and found out that my life was in danger. Hurrying to the security officer, she called him, which is how my life was saved. Hearing that, I expressed my gratitude to her for whatever she did. After that incident, the people of that gang started to keep an eye around the hospital, having found that their fellow got killed because of a nurse's report. Considering it to be a threat to my life, I left my job at that hospital and started working in the medical center and have been working there ever since.